The wind rolled across the flat fields of southeast England in the spring of 1944, carrying the scent of damp earth and fuel oil. From a distance, the countryside appeared transformed into a staging ground for invasion. Rows of tanks stood motionless in open farmland. Artillery pieces lined hedgerows. Supply trucks clustered near temporary depots. Camouflage nets stretched between trees, concealing the outlines of what seemed to be a massive armored force preparing to strike across the channel. But German reconnaissance aircraft occasionally slipped through cloud cover, cameras clicking as they passed overhead. From altitude, the formations looked convincing, organized, deliberate, immense. But many of the tanks did not weigh 40 tons. They weighed almost nothing. Crafted from rubberized canvas and inflated by air compressors, these tanks could be folded, transported by truck, and erected within minutes. From the sky, through the lens of a high-altitude camera, they cast shadows like steel. Beside them stood wooden aircraft, dummy landing craft, and carefully staged vehicle tracks carved into soil to simulate heavy movement. This was not a battlefield. It was a performance. By June 1944, Allied forces were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. The success of that invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, depended not only on firepower but on surprise. If Germany concentrated its strongest divisions at the true landing site, and the beaches could become a killing ground. The Allies needed Hitler and the German High Command to believe the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Instead, the real assault would fall on the beaches of Normandy. In quiet English villages, ordinary fields became theaters of deception. Inflatable tanks stood in morning mist. Soldiers from specialized deception units rehearsed the art of illusion. Radio operators transmitted scripted chatter, reinforcing the lie. From Berlin's perspective, the buildup was undeniable. What German intelligence did not yet realize was that they were studying an army that did not exist, and in the balance hung the fate of thousands who would soon step onto the shores of occupied France. By early 1944, the Allies faced a strategic dilemma of enormous consequence. The invasion of Western Europe was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. American divisions had poured into Britain throughout 1943. British factories operated around the clock. Ports along the southern coast filled with landing craft, fuel depots, and endless rows of equipment. Germany knew an invasion was coming. The only question was where. The most logical target was Pas-de-Calais. It lay at the narrowest crossing of the English Channel, barely 21 miles at its closest point. Its beaches offered direct access to northern France and the road networks leading toward Belgium and Germany. From a purely geographical standpoint, it was the obvious choice. Adolf Hitler believed this strongly. German defensive planning along the Atlantic Wall reflected that assumption. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt oversaw broad defensive strategy in the West, while Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected coastal fortifications personally. Concrete bunkers rose above beaches. Anti-tank obstacles littered the shoreline. Minefields were expanded, yet the true Allied objective was Normandy. Wider beaches, less heavily fortified, but farther from Britain. To land there successfully, the Allies needed German armored divisions to remain elsewhere during the crucial early hours of the invasion. How could they convince German intelligence that the main attack would strike at Pas-de-Calais while secretly preparing for Normandy? The answer required more than silence. And if Allied forces simply concealed activity in Normandy, suspicion would grow. Instead, planners determined that they must create visible evidence so overwhelming and so plausible that Germany would commit to defending the wrong coastline. This deception campaign became known as Operation Fortitude, part of the broader strategic plan called Operation Bodyguard. Its purpose was not merely to hide the truth, but to present a convincing alternative reality. A German intelligence relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance and intercepted radio traffic. They tracked troop concentrations, supply dumps, and command structures. To mislead them, the Allies would have to simulate all of it, down to the smallest detail. The central mystery was psychological as much as military. Could an army be invented convincingly enough to draw enemy divisions away from the real battlefield? Could rubber, canvas, false radio signals, and then staged logistics persuade Berlin that the decisive blow would fall at Pas de Calais? And if the illusion failed, if even a fraction of German commanders doubted the evidence, Normandy's beaches might become a catastrophe. The deception would have to withstand scrutiny from some of the most experienced military analysts in Europe. It would need to look real from 20,000 feet, and it would need to endure long enough for history to change. In the quiet village of Dovercourt, not far from England's eastern coastline, life in early 1944 moved under the shadow of invasion. The air carried the constant tang of salt and coal smoke from passing trains. Barrage balloons hovered in gray skies like silent guardians. Road signs had been removed or turned to confuse any potential enemy landing. Windows were taped against blast damage. Every night, blackout curtains sealed homes into darkness. Among the villagers was Arthur Whitfield, a middle-aged baker whose shop stood at the corner of the high street. His mornings began before dawn. He worked by dim yellow light, kneading dough in silence while the wireless murmured distant war bulletins. Flour dust hung in the air like fog. The smell of yeast and warm bread provided one of the few comforts in a country long accustomed to rationing. Arthur's customers were no longer only villagers. American soldiers had become a common sight, yet their accents foreign but friendly. They lined up for bread and tea, boots heavy with mud from nearby training fields. Their uniforms, olive drab jackets, steel helmets slung at their sides, contrasted with the British khaki Arthur had grown used to since 1939. From his bakery window, Arthur could see what appeared to be an enormous military buildup in the surrounding countryside. Tanks were parked in open fields. Convoys of trucks moved deliberately along narrow roads. At night, engines idled and generators hummed. The ground bore deep tire tracks that suggested the weight of armored divisions assembling for something vast. Rumors circulated quietly among villagers. Pas de Calais, some whispered. It was the obvious place to strike, the shortest crossing, the most logical target. Soldiers seemed confident. Their presence felt permanent. Arthur noticed something peculiar, though he could not quite explain it. The tanks sometimes shifted positions overnight without leaving fresh mud. The sound of engines occasionally felt hollow, lighter than expected. Once, when delivering bread to a nearby encampment, he brushed against what he thought was steel and felt canvas instead. He said nothing. Wartime Britain was accustomed to secrecy. Civilians were trained not to ask questions. Posters warned that careless talk cost lives. Arthur assumed what he had felt was simply unfamiliar material or protective covering. Yet the doubt lingered. The village itself seemed transformed into a stage. American units, identified as the first U.S. Army group under General George S. Patton, were said to be assembling nearby. Patton's name carried weight. He was bold, aggressive, respected. If he was here, the invasion must be imminent. Arthur's bakery remained ordinary. Bread was sliced, ration books were stamped, and children still chased each other past sandbagged storefronts. But beyond the scent of flour and wood smoke, something artificial stood in the fields, and it was meant to be seen. By late April 1944, the countryside around Dovercourt no longer resembled farmland. It resembled a launch point for war. Long lines of what appeared to be Sherman tanks stood in open fields, their turrets angled toward the channel. Artillery batteries were positioned along hedgerows. Rows of tents stretched across meadows where sheep had once grazed. From a distance, the scale was overwhelming. German reconnaissance aircraft continued to probe Britain's southeastern coast whenever weather permitted. High above the cloud cover, cameras clicked methodically. The Luftwaffe's pilots risked anti-aircraft fire and interception to capture photographs of the buildup. The images were rushed back to intelligence analysts in occupied France and Berlin. What they saw seemed unmistakable. Arthur Whitfield noticed the rhythm of activity around the encampments. Convoys arrived at carefully spaced intervals. Soldiers marched in visible formations during daylight hours. Radio masts rose prominently against the skyline, their wires clearly visible even from village roads. It felt deliberate, as though someone wanted the movement to be observed. One afternoon, Arthur delivered crates of bread to a supply depot on the village outskirts. An American sergeant met him at the entrance, checking identification carefully. Inside, Arthur glimpsed stacks of fuel drums and crates marked with stenciled military codes. Everything appeared authentic. Yet again, he felt something slightly off. A gust of wind rolled across the field, causing one of the distant tanks to sway, not heavily, but subtly. Its metal surface rippled almost imperceptibly, and the sound it made was not the groan of machinery, but the soft flap of taut material shifting under pressure. Nearby, a soldier casually kicked one of the tank's tracks into position. The tracks flexed unnaturally. Arthur looked away immediately. He was no engineer. He told himself he had imagined it. Britain was at war. Equipment was sometimes experimental, modified, or covered for concealment. He returned to his shop and resumed kneading dough, though his thoughts lingered on what he had seen. Elsewhere in the village, other peculiarities emerged. Soldiers were seen inflating large shapes at dawn using portable air compressors. Wooden frameworks were assembled, then painted with careful shading to simulate shadow and depth. At night, controlled radio chatter crackled from tents, broadcasting coded transmissions at volumes just loud enough to be intercepted beyond the coast. The pattern was consistent. Activity was concentrated where it would be most visible to aerial reconnaissance. Equipment was arranged neatly in open terrain, not hidden. Tire tracks were carved deliberately into soil to simulate heavy vehicle movement. Dummy landing craft lined parts of the Thames estuary, their outlines designed to resemble real invasion vessels from above. This was not concealment. It was exhibition. The question was no longer whether something unusual was happening. The question was whether it was meant to deceive an enemy watching from the sky. Arthur sensed he was witnessing something larger than he understood. He did not yet know the name Operation Fortitude. He did not know that these inflated machines were tools of psychological warfare, but he knew, with quiet certainty, that the army in the fields was not entirely real, and that realization carried its own risk. Arthur Whitfield was not a man inclined toward conspiracy. He had spent his life measuring flour by weight and yeast by instinct. Yet war sharpened the senses of even the most ordinary civilians. What he had seen in the fields, the sway of canvas, the hollow thud of something lighter than steel, did not align with the image of a massive armored force preparing for invasion. Still, he spoke to no one. In Britain during wartime, silence was survival. The Official Secrets Act cast a long shadow over daily life. Civilians were constantly reminded that careless speculation could aid the enemy. In Arthur's suspicion remained internal, an unease rather than an accusation. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photographs of southeastern England. Analysts examined troop concentrations near Kent and Essex, particularly around Dover and the Thames estuary. The scale of apparent buildup supported an existing German assumption. the invasion would strike at Pas de Calais. What the Germans did not know was that much of what they were seeing had been engineered by a specialized British deception unit known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, nicknamed the Ghost Army. This American unit, along with British camouflage specialists, created visual illusions using inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, dummy artillery, and fake landing craft. But the deception went beyond objects. Radio operators generated scripted wireless traffic, mimicking the communications patterns of entire divisions. Signal units transmitted false call signs associated with units that did not physically exist in those locations. German signals intelligence, relying heavily on radio interception, recorded what appeared to be the activity of a formidable force. Even more crucial were double agents operating under British control. The double-cross system had successfully turned captured German spies into controlled assets. Agents such as Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, fed carefully constructed intelligence reports back to Germany. Garbo confirmed that General George S. Patton commanded a powerful formation, 1st U.S. Army Group, poised to strike at Calais. German intelligence trusted Garbo. Arthur, unaware of these layers, simply observed the surface performance. He noticed that some tanks were repositioned easily by small crews. He heard American soldiers joking quietly about inflating the division. Yet he also sensed discipline. No one spoke openly. The village became a stage set maintained with precision. At night, searchlights cut across low clouds while anti-aircraft guns remained ready. The deception had to look authentic under stress. If German reconnaissance intensified, or if spies on the ground reported inconsistencies, the illusion would collapse. Arthur's bakery became a quiet listening post. Soldiers passing through dropped hints unintentionally. A corporal once remarked, "Let them think we're going to Calais." He stopped mid-sentence, glanced around, and changed the subject. The clues were subtle, but consistent. The army in the fields existed, but only in part, and somewhere beyond the channel, German planners were studying every visible detail, preparing their defenses accordingly. And the deception was working precisely because it reinforced what Germany already believed. But for it to succeed fully, it had to survive the moment of truth, the real invasion. And that moment was approaching. By late May 1944, the pressure intensified across southeastern England. Weather reports were studied obsessively, tides were calculated, the window for invasion narrowed to days. Yet the illusion in the fields could not falter, not even briefly. Arthur Whitfield noticed the change immediately. Soldiers who once joked quietly in his bakery now spoke less. Their movements seemed sharper, more focused. Convoys increased at night. Engines rumbled along narrow village roads under strict blackout conditions. The scent of petrol lingered long after the vehicles passed. At the same time, the inflatable tanks remained prominently visible in open farmland. They were maintained daily, checked for punctures, repositioned carefully, and even rotated to simulate operational readiness. Wooden aircraft stood in mock airstrips, casting convincing silhouettes at dawn. The danger lay in timing. If German reconnaissance observed sudden reductions in visible forces, if they detected that the apparent concentration near Dover thinned abruptly, it could trigger suspicion. German command might conclude that Pas de Calais was a feint, and that another coastline, perhaps Normandy, was the real objective. And German aerial activity increased sporadically when weather permitted. Though the Luftwaffe had been weakened significantly by 1944, occasional reconnaissance flights still reached the English coast. Anti-aircraft guns thundered in response. Smoke drifted across fields. Arthur could feel the vibration through his bakery walls. One evening, a low-flying aircraft passed overhead before disappearing into cloud cover. The following morning, Arthur noticed soldiers frantically adjusting positions of dummy vehicles. Inflatable tanks were reinforced. Tire tracks were freshly carved into the soil to maintain the appearance of heavy movement. The deception required constant maintenance. Meanwhile, in Berlin, intelligence analysts continued to monitor Allied radio traffic. Reports from double agents reinforced the narrative that General Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group remained positioned in southeastern England, and German High Command believed Patton, regarded as the Allies' most aggressive commander, would lead the decisive assault. On June 5, 1944, storms battered the English Channel. Winds tore at tents and rattled shutters. Arthur struggled to secure his bakery door against gusts. Rumors of imminent invasion swirled quietly among soldiers sheltering from rain. Then, in the early hours of June 6th, Allied forces began landing in Normandy. But the deception did not end there. German commanders hesitated, and many believed Normandy might be a diversion, a preliminary attack intended to draw forces away from Pas de Calais. Hitler himself delayed committing armored reserves fully, convinced the main blow was still coming elsewhere. For weeks after D-Day, the inflatable army in southeastern England continued its performance. Radio traffic persisted. Dummy tanks remained visible. The illusion endured long enough to freeze German divisions in place. Arthur heard news of heavy fighting in France through his wireless. He understood that the soldiers who had bought bread from him were now crossing beaches under fire. The danger had passed for the village. But on the shores of Normandy, the success of deception meant the difference between survival and slaughter. The illusion had held just long enough. At dawn on June 6, 1944, Allied paratroopers drifted down over Normandy beneath low cloud and scattered flak. A landing craft churned toward beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The largest amphibious invasion in history had begun. Yet in Berlin, uncertainty lingered. German radar stations had detected unusual activity in the Channel. Reports flowed rapidly to headquarters in France and onward to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Field commanders demanded clarity. Was this the main invasion or merely a diversion? Hitler had long believed that Pas de Calais was the true objective. Its proximity to Britain made it the logical choice. Intelligence summaries reinforced this view. Reports from double agents, most notably Juan Pujol Garcia, Garbo, continued to insist that General Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group remained poised to strike at Calais. The inflatable tanks in Kent and Essex still stood in open fields. Radio chatter continued at convincing levels. From aerial reconnaissance and intercepted transmissions, the Phantom Army appeared intact. The German armored divisions stationed near Calais were placed on alert, but not immediately released toward Normandy. Hitler hesitated. He feared committing reserves prematurely. The possibility that Normandy was a feint weighed heavily on decision-makers. The climax of the deception was not dramatic or explosive. It unfolded through delay. Hours became days. As Allied troops struggled to expand their beachheads in Normandy, where German reinforcements did not arrive in the overwhelming numbers that might have crushed the landings. The 15th Army, positioned near Pas de Calais, remained largely in place. Arthur Whitfield, listening to BBC broadcasts in his bakery, heard fragmented reports of heavy fighting. Casualties were high. Beaches were contested fiercely. Yet the invasion held. Behind the scenes, Operation Fortitude continued even after D-Day. The Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group remained operational on paper and in appearance. German intelligence maintained its belief that a second, larger invasion was imminent at Calais. It was not until late July 1944, weeks after Normandy was firmly secured, that German High Command accepted the truth. By then, Allied forces had broken out of the beachhead and advanced inland. The inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and scripted radio transmissions had served their purpose, and they had anchored German expectations to the wrong coastline long enough for the real assault to succeed. The discovery, when it came, was quiet and humiliating. Analysts realized that much of what they had trusted, photographs, intercepted signals, agent reports, had been part of an elaborate illusion. No dramatic confession marked the moment, only the slow recognition that the decisive invasion had not occurred where they had prepared most heavily, and by then it was far too late to correct. The success of the deception surrounding Operation Fortitude cannot be measured solely by the existence of inflatable tanks or wooden aircraft. Its true significance lay in its strategic impact during the critical opening phase of the Normandy invasion. Operation Fortitude was part of the broader Allied deception plan known as Operation Bodyguard, designed to mislead Germany about the timing and location of the D-Day landings. Within Fortitude South the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, commanded by General George S. Patton, was created to convince Germany that Pas-de-Calais was the primary invasion target. The deception worked because it reinforced existing German assumptions. Hitler and his commanders already believed Calais was the logical choice. The visual buildup in southeastern England, combined with false radio traffic and reports from trusted double agents, confirmed that belief. As a result, the German 15th Army remained positioned near Pas-de-Calais for weeks after D-Day, anticipating a second major assault. Even after Allied forces secured beachheads in Normandy, German command hesitated to redeploy its strongest armored divisions fully. This delay proved decisive. The Normandy landings faced fierce resistance, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American casualties were severe. But the absence of rapid, concentrated German reinforcements allowed Allied forces to consolidate their foothold. Within weeks, they established supply lines and expanded inland. The deception also demonstrated the evolution of modern intelligence warfare. Rather than relying solely on secrecy, Allied planners embraced controlled visibility. They allowed Germany to see what it expected to see: inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and simulated logistics were not crude props. They were components of a coordinated psychological strategy. Radio deception played an equally critical role. Signal units replicated the communication patterns of entire divisions, creating an electronic footprint that convinced German signals intelligence of the Phantom Army's authenticity. Meanwhile, the double-cross system ensured that human intelligence reinforced the same narrative. By late July 1944, the Allied forces broke through German lines in Normandy during Operation Cobra. The collapse of German defenses in France followed. The liberation of Paris came in August. The success of the Normandy invasion marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in Western Europe. Inflatable tanks did not win the war alone, but they bought time measured in hours and days that allowed real divisions to survive their most vulnerable moment. The outcome proved that perception could shape battlefield reality. An army made of air had redirected the movement of steel, and in the balance between illusion and action, illusion had tipped the scale just long enough for history to change. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the inflatable tanks were long deflated, folded, and stored away. The fields of Kent and Essex returned gradually to farmland. Wooden aircraft were dismantled. Entire tracks faded beneath rain and harvest. Villages like Dovercourt resumed rhythms, shaped by peace rather than performance. Arthur Whitfield continued baking bread. Soldiers who once lined his shop disappeared into memory. The war's vast machinery moved on, leaving behind only fragments: photographs, ration books, faded blackout curtains. For civilians, the deception had been invisible by design. For years after the war, many details of Operation Fortitude remained classified, and the existence of the Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group was not widely discussed. The specialized deception units, including the American 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the so-called Ghost Army, received little public recognition. Their contribution was subtle, buried beneath the more dramatic narrative of D-Day's beaches. Historians later confirmed the scope of the operation. Operation Fortitude successfully convinced German High Command that Pas-de-Calais remained the primary invasion threat, even after the Normandy landings began. German divisions stayed positioned near Calais well into July 1944, reducing the immediate pressure on Allied forces in Normandy. The legacy of inflatable tanks and scripted radio traffic extends beyond the Second World War. Modern military doctrine continues to emphasize deception, psychological operations, and the manipulation of enemy perception. The lessons of 1944 demonstrated that intelligence warfare required creativity as much as secrecy. In post-war Germany, analyses of intelligence failures acknowledged how Allied deception exploited confirmation bias within German command. Hitler's fixation on Pas-de-Calais made him vulnerable to reinforcement of that belief, and the illusion succeeded not because Germany lacked intelligence, but because the deception aligned perfectly with what German planners already expected. In quiet cemeteries and memorials across Normandy, the cost of those few critical days in June 1944 remains etched in stone. Thousands of Allied soldiers lost their lives securing the beachhead. The inflatable tanks did not spare them entirely, but they ensured that the assault was not overwhelmed by the full weight of German reserves. Today, photographs of the dummy armor, rubber tanks propped in English fields, may appear almost theatrical. Yet in 1944, viewed through grainy aerial images and intercepted radio chatter, they represented convincing evidence. An army made of canvas and air helped shield a real army made of flesh and blood. The deception did not fire a single shot, but it altered where those shots would land. And in war, that difference can decide the fate of continents.